Hi, and thank you so much for popping by. My name is Dr. Baluzzi, and you're most welcome to this conversation today. I have been following the news in Botswana and this amazing investment that is coming from Qatar, the 12 billion. It's 12 billion, right? The history-making 12 billion investment that was promised or committed to Botswana by the Qatar leadership or Qatar representatives who were in the country. As I said before in the clip where I was talking about Kosi Kafela and his partnership with AfriForum, I can absolutely understand why Botswana is looking to potential investors to inject this cash injection into the country, because right now diamonds are not selling. There's also a obvious public health crisis, which has resulted in the declaration of a national public health emergency. But just as is the case with the Kafela and AfriForum partnership, I do have a sense of hesitancy, right? I'm a little bit hesitant, potentially suspicious of this partnership with Botswana and Qatar. Sorry, I almost said Dubai. And due to my suspicion, I then decided, you know what, let me find out a little bit more about Qatar and its intentions or its ambitions or the objectives that they have behind this cash investment. I found out that Qatar actually had a 300 billion budget to invest in Africa, including sub-Saharan countries such as Botswana, such as Zimbabwe, such as Zambia, such as Tanzania. They've also invested in countries such as Nigeria, the Democratic Republic of Congo. Qatar is actually deliberately and intentionally targeting African countries because one of their intentions is to increase the reach of the Qatar Airways. So it looks like in exchange for the 12 billion investment in the case of Botswana, or in exchange of the other billions of investment in countries such as the Democratic Republic of Congo, they are basically saying, we can do this for you if you can in return take on our intention of growing Qatar Airways, right? So I don't know. I look at all the other partnerships that Botswana has had with other countries or other regions, and I know that there were also similar disgruntlements about certain partnerships and certain investments or donations that other countries have made. I do remember a time earlier on when there were disgruntlements about what investments from the Western world would do to the cultures of local Botswana. For example, people were worried that by receiving investments from the Western world, Botswana would then be encouraging aspects such as the LGBTQ, right? There was a lot of talk about this in the earlier years. So I'm looking at Qatar and also thinking the same thing, right? And just wondering what kind of cultural exchanges may these investments be bringing. I know that in this case, this partnership is very business orientated, right? It's all about investments. But I do also understand that in the exchange of these investments is going to be an exchange of cultures, right? Qatar is definitely going to be sharing its culture with Botswana, as much as Botswana may attempt to share their culture with Qatar. But in this case, I don't think it's an equal partnership. So Qatar is going to be the partner that will be more overbearing on Botswana by virtue of the fact that they are the ones that are giving these amounts of money to Botswana, right? Botswana is still on the receiving end of this aid, in other words, right? So the only thing that has changed here is that the Gulf nations or the GCC nations are now potentially taking over the gap that has been created by the Westerners when they withdrew their investments in Africa. So when the West withdraws their investments in Africa, it basically looks like Qatar or the GCC or the Gulf nations are then willing to take over. So the Gulf nations or the GCC nations are described as countries including Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, etc., right? So these are the countries that have come in very strong to invest in Africa and to obviously, in this case, it looks like they're taking over the gap that was left by the Western world, right? So as I said, Qatar has an overall budget of 300 billion that they're investing specifically in Africa and in Asia, and specifically to ensure that Qatar Airwaves can increase and expand its aviation strategy within the African and Asian nations. Now, like I'm saying, I can understand, like the Kgosi Kgafela deal with AfriForum, why Botswana would take on this kind of partnership. I can absolutely appreciate that because things are not looking good for Botswana right now. The indicators are not looking good for Botswana right now. And at this point, I'm thinking this is a survival strategy. And just like President Boko was saying, this would temporarily relieve Botswana. This is temporary relief for Botswana, right? But at the same time, I'm saying what are the long-term effects of partnering with a country like Qatar, a country that doesn't have very strong human rights records, a country that doesn't have that much respect for or independence for women, a country that has a lot of inequality, just like Botswana. Qatar also has high margins of inequality. So it's a wealthy country. Botswana is going on to be a high income country, but within all of this wealth and high income status is massive, glaring disparities when it comes to inequality, the poverty that we talk about in Botswana, the poverty that is seen in some populations there in Qatar. So these are other factors that actually are similar when it comes to Botswana and Qatar. The case of Qatar, for example, Qatar is similar to Botswana because it has high rates of gender-based violence. In fact, Qatar is described as having extensive gender-based violence. So when it comes to these two factors, when it comes to this one factor, Qatar and Botswana have something in common. Qatar will not only be exchanging investments, Qatar will definitely, being the country with the upper hand, being the country that is more powerful in this partnership, they are definitely going to be transferring some of their cultures to Botswana, as we have rightly seen already with the visit by the Qatarian representative. We saw a story where President Boko's son had to be part of the delegation because that is the anticipated culture from Qatar. So we already know that when it comes to women's rights, so it's very interesting really to see how these Gulf nations include countries such as Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Oman. So it's very interesting to see that the Gulf nations or the GCC nations are trying to align their own investment needs with Africa's developmental needs. So basically, the Gulf nations or the GCC nations are replacing the West in terms of being the ones that are donating and funding to Africa. So it's basically a case of out with the West and in with the Gulf nations, or out with the West and in with the GCC nations. Yeah, I'm just not sure. Actually, more than not that I'm not sure, but all I'm saying is that this deal with Qatar and Botswana really makes me think of the Khosi Kgafela and AfriForum deal, where as I was looking into these deals, I'm starting to wonder just some of the ethical and moral considerations that we might be overlooking when we are creating these partnerships, and specifically because we are on such survival mode, right? I think the issue is that we are on survival mode. Things are not going well, so anything that we can find is seemingly an option for us. But like I'm saying, Qatar, it's not just Qatar, it's actually the GCC nations or the Gulf nations in totality that are in an investment drive in Africa in order to meet the gaps that the West are creating by removing their donorship, right? Alrighty, my friend, that's all I had to say about this Qatar deal. That in fact, it's quite exciting. It's better than nothing for Africa, honestly, when I think about it. But I still say there are some partnerships that really need us to consider the moral and ethical considerations, that really want us to consider what the consequences might be for partnering with such nations, right? Particularly when we consider the history of the people we are partnering with. But anyway, my friend, I thank you so much for popping by. I hope you are having a lovely day where you are, but most importantly, I hope you're having a healthy day wherever you're watching me from. Bye.